Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah smells like antiseptic and burned coffee, fluorescent lights humming their relentless electric prayer over linoleum floors that haven't seen the outside world in 40 years. Laura Bennett moves through the ER at 6:19 a.m., her scrubs a faded navy blue that matches nothing in particular, her badge clipped precisely at the fourth rib where it won't swing into sterile fields. She's been a civilian nurse here for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, not that she's counting. The kind of counting she does is different now. It's the counting of days where nobody asks who she was, where her hands move through their work and her voice stays low and her past stays buried so deep that even she sometimes forgets the weight of it. The ER at shift change is controlled chaos. 7 beds occupied. 1 trauma waiting. 2 nurses giving report in the corner, their voices the familiar shorthand of people who stopped explaining themselves to each other years ago. Laura listens without appearing to listen, the way she did in Ramadi when she learned that the difference between living and dying was the difference between hearing everything and letting people believe you heard nothing. She checks the cardiac monitor on bed for stable rhythm, good saturation, and moves to the supply room to begin the inventory that nobody else bothers to complete with precision. That's when she notices it. The supply order log for the past 6 weeks shows 12 portable ultrasound machines purchased from MedTech Solutions at $3,400 each. $40,800. Her eyes pause on the number. She knows there are 3 machines in this ER. Maybe 4 if you count the one in cardiology that Sacred Heart shares. She pulls the inventory sheet taped to the supply closet wall. 3 machines listed. Condition, functional. Location, Trauma Bay 1, Trauma Bay 3, and the physician station. No phantom machines. No overflow. No explanation for the other 9. The fluorescent light above her buzzes. She doesn't flinch. She writes down the discrepancy in the small notebook she keeps in her scrub pocket, not because she plans to report it, but because information is currency and she learned long ago that carrying currency quietly is safer than announcing it. She knows what phantom equipment charges look like. She knows what happens when supply orders don't match physical inventory. She's seen it in the accounting systems of 3 different military bases across 2 decades. At 7:15 a.m., Dr. James Sterling arrives at the ER with the kind of entrance that announces him before he reaches the desk. He's 42, with hair that costs more than Laura's monthly rent and a Rolex that catches the fluorescent light like a beacon. He wears his white coat the way other men wear armor. Authority is his native language. The physicians who work under him speak it fluently, the careful deference, the nodded acknowledgments, the way they step slightly back when he approaches. He runs Sacred Heart's ER with the kind of control that makes people comfortable and suspicious simultaneously. Comfortable because everything works. Suspicious for exactly the same reason. Laura emerges from the supply room with a fresh pack of 14-gauge for catheters and doesn't make eye contact. She was good at not making eye contact long before it became a civilian habit. In the field, you watched people's hands, their shoulders, the way their breathing changed. You didn't watch their faces. Faces lied. Bodies told the truth. She recognizes the moment Sterling notices her because she hears his breath change, a slight intake, like his caught scent of something that doesn't fit the pattern of his morning. Bennett, he says. It's not a greeting. It's a catalog number. Dr. Sterling. She keeps moving. 2 patient rooms need restocking. The 7 a.m. medications for bed 6 need verification. There's always something that requires her hands to be occupied and her attention seemingly elsewhere. I need the supply requisitions for the last month. He's at the desk now, his presence somehow making the ER smaller, like his certainty takes up space. Personal inventory. I'm auditing equipment costs. Laura doesn't pause. She doesn't look back. But somewhere in the architecture of her chest, a door closes. She recognizes the beginning of something. In the military, they called it escalation. In the civilian world, people call it office politics. They're the same animal wearing different uniforms. She retrieves the requisition folder from the file drawer, the one marked 2024 capital equipment purchases in careful block letters, and sets it on the desk 6 feet from where he stands. That distance is intentional. It's the distance between professional courtesy and overstep. She moves back to the medication cart without waiting for his response, because waiting would be engagement and engagement would be confirmation that she's noticed what he's noticed. Which is that she noticed. For the next 3 hours, Sterling reads. She watches him in the peripheral way she watches everything, from the corner of her vision, the way prey animals watch predators. His jaw tightens twice. His left hand makes a fist and relaxes. He pulls out his own notebook and begins writing things down with the kind of aggressive pressure that suggests the pen is barely surviving the encounter. At one point, he looks up from the pages and his eyes find her across the ER. Not where she is. Where she was. She's already moved to bed 2 to change a dressing. The look he gives the space she just vacated is the look of a man who realizes the trap his building might have a trapdoor underneath it. At 9:40 a.m., a 34-year-old construction worker comes in with crushing chest pain, diaphoretic, pale as a funeral flower. Laura gets him to the EKG station while Sterling appears from his office like he's been waiting for an emergency to interrupt his thoughts. The next 40 minutes blur into the familiar choreography of acute MI protocol, oxygen, aspirin, troponin labs, dual antiplatelet therapy, the quiet efficient movement of people who've done this dance 1,000 times. Sterling works like a surgeon, which is trained to be, all precision and competence. Laura works like a soldier, which she was trained to be, all anticipation and preparation. They don't speak. They don't need to. The patient's heart speaks loudly enough, the monitor beeping its steady message that someone's mortality just became negotiable. By the time the patient's transferred to the cath lab, the cardiac team already scrubbing in, Sterling is back at his desk with the supply folder. She sees him make a phone call at 10:35 a.m. She doesn't hear it, the ER is too loud, monitors and conversation and the overhead paging system calling out names of people who no longer exist, but she sees his posture. The way his shoulders reset. The way his free hand moves once, a quick decisive gesture, like he's just made a decision that will have consequences for someone. She's clearing the trauma bay when he approaches. Not with his usual momentum. With something slower. Something that feels like intention taking the shape of casualness. How long have you been a nurse, Bennett? He's examining his fingernails while he asks. The Rolex catches the light again. 12 years in civilian facilities, she says. The answer is technically true. It's also a symphony of omission. 12 years of documented civilian employment. It doesn't mention the first 19 years. It doesn't mention the rank she held. It doesn't mention the reason she wears civilian scrubs instead of desert camouflage anymore. You notice things. He's still not looking at her. Supply discrepancies. Inventory inconsistencies. You ask questions about requisitions. Accuracy matters. She's pulling the contaminated trauma drapes into the red biohazard bag. Her hands move with the kind of precision that suggests this isn't her first decontamination procedure. It's not even her 1,000th. Patient safety depends on equipment being where the records say it is. Of course. Sterling smiles. It's the smile of a predator who's just realized its prey has already noticed the trap. But there's a chain of command, Bennett. You notice discrepancies, you bring them to your charge nurse. You don't conduct your own investigations into supply management. I noticed the discrepancy while restocking. Her voice is even. Deferential. The voice she's learned to use in the 3 years she's been pretending to be someone smaller than she is. I didn't investigate anything. Still. He picks up a pair of gloves from the side counter, examines them, doesn't put them on. It's important to remember our roles. Our limitations. Some things are above the nursing level. The fluorescent light above them buzzes again. It's the sound of electricity looking for a home, finding only air and emptiness. Laura ties off the biohazard bag and moves toward the disposal bin, passing within 2 feet of Sterling. Close enough to smell his cologne, expensive, probably Italian, definitely chosen to broadcast something about him. Close enough to feel the small heat signature of his anger, which is trying very hard to contain. "I'll focus on patient care," she says. She doesn't add doctor. The omission is subtle but present, the way a wound is present even when you're not actively looking at it. By 11:20 a.m., Sterling is in his office. She knows because she can see his door from the medication station, and he's moving like a man who's made a decision and doesn't particularly like the feeling. At 12:56 p.m., a formal email arrives in the staff email system. It's addressed to all ER personnel, but she knows it's for her. New policy effective immediately. All equipment discrepancies must be reported directly to Dr. Sterling, in writing, with documentation of where the discrepancy was found. Any direct inventory audits conducted by nursing staff are considered insubordination and will be documented accordingly. Laura reads it once. Doesn't read it again. The message is clear. By 2:15 p.m., her personnel file receives an entry, employee demonstrated attitude of insubordination when corrected regarding chain of command protocols. Requires closer supervision and remedial coaching on hospital hierarchy. She doesn't see the entry because Sterling is careful, but she feels it the way you feel a knife before it breaks the skin. The attack isn't direct yet. It's preparation. It's documentation. It's the foundation of something that hasn't yet become unstoppable but is building toward it with the inevitability of an incoming storm. That night, at 11:48 p.m., she sits in her apartment with the television off and the lights down. In her closet, on the top shelf behind the winter boots she never uses, sits a pair of desert combat boots. They're 20 years old. They're worn at the heel where they've been stepped out of in the dark. The sole is separating on the right one. The laces are still double-knotted the way she tied them in Baghdad, the year she pulled an 8-year-old boy from a burning Humvee while rounds walked up the ground around her like the footsteps of something with teeth. She hasn't worn those boots since that day. She hasn't thrown them away either. They're the only thing she has from the life the government decided never happened. She doesn't take them down. But she knows they're there. She knows Sterling is building something. She knows the next move hasn't arrived yet, but what happened next changed everything. The ER doors hissed open at 18:47 hours and everything changed. The ambulance crew wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man convulsing, every muscle firing at once, his body arching like something was trying to escape from inside his skin. Petty Officer Jake Morrison. 28 years old. Glasgow coma scale of 6. An IED blast in Helmand province had left shrapnel embedded in his temporal lobe, and now his pupils were pinpoint, unreactive, his respiratory drive already compromised before anyone had even cut his shirt away. Laura saw it immediately. She always saw it. The way his chest wasn't expanding enough. The way his lips were starting to take on that faint blue tint that meant the brainstem was dying. She'd seen it in Fallujah too, in the medical bay at FOB Shank, in the faces of men who didn't have 4 hours to spare while doctors debated protocol. Dr. Sterling arrived in the trauma bay like he owned it, his white coat pressed so perfectly it looked laminated. He scanned Morrison's monitor, blood pressure 94/58 and dropping, heart rate 142, O2 sat 89, and pulled up the medication tray without hesitation. 10 milligrams diazepam, he announced. Now. Laura was already moving toward the medication dispensary, her hands on autopilot, but her brain caught on something wrong. She turned back. Doctor, his respiratory drive is already compromised. Sedation could push him into respiratory arrest with those pupils. The room went still. Rubber gloves snapped like gunshots as other nurses froze mid-movement. Sterling's head rotated toward her with the mechanical precision of a surveillance camera finding a target. His eyes were the color of winter sky, beautiful and absolutely devoid of anything resembling mercy. "Nurse Bennett," he said, and his voice carried the particular music of a man who had been waiting for an excuse. "When I want a medical opinion from someone whose highest qualification is emptying bedpans, I'll ask for it. Until then, keep your mouth shut and do your job." Morrison's mother stood 3 feet away in the corner of the bay, still wearing her rain-soaked jacket, her hand pressed against her mouth. Her son's body convulsed again and she made a sound that wasn't quite a word, the kind of noise only mothers make when watching their children die in increments. Laura took one measured breath. Just one. Her hand stayed steady on the medication tray. She drew up the diazepam with the kind of focus monks probably applied to meditation. The needle went in through the foreport with a soft click. The sedative entered Morrison's bloodstream and his convulsions began to slow, and Laura watched his O2 sat climb 89, 87, 84, and then nosedive to 79 before Sterling even noticed anything was wrong. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling, without breaking rhythm in her vital sign monitoring, without allowing a single muscle in her face to betray the fact that she could see Morrison's respiratory drive collapsing in real time while two other physicians stood at the foot of the bed with their arms crossed, watching, waiting for someone else to make the first mistake. The rest of the shift passed in that strange kind of silence that happens in emergency rooms when something catastrophic has occurred but nobody's ready to acknowledge it yet. Morrison stabilized, barely, his O2 sat climbing back to 88 with aggressive oxygen delivery and a bag valve mask held tight by a respiratory therapist whose name Laura would never learn. Sterling left the trauma bay without looking back. 30 minutes later, Laura was helping organize the supply cart when she saw the write-up. It was posted on the break room bulletin board where everyone read the schedule and the infection control updates and the staff birthday list. Sterling's handwriting was precise, almost calligraphic, formal written reprimand, insubordination and questioning of physician judgment in patient care setting. Employee R. Bennett questioned sedation order in front of patient family, undermining chain of command and creating unsafe atmosphere of doubt regarding physician authority. 12 other nurses worked that floor. Laura watched 6 of them read it. She sat down at the corner table with her coffee, black, no sugar, the taste like something burned and left outside for 3 days, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened was nothing. Everything happened through the absence of something. The first nurse who came into the break room was Cassandra, who'd shared countless shifts with Laura, who'd borrowed her scrubs twice when she'd forgotten hers, who'd complained about Sterling's incompetence for 3 years. Cassandra read the write-up, her jaw tightened, and she deliberately looked away from the corner table. She grabbed her coffee cup and left without a word. Her shoes squeaked on the linoleum like they were announcing her exit. Then came Marcus, then Jennifer, then David. Each one read the board. Each one saw Laura sitting alone at the corner table. Each one decided, in the span of 10 seconds, that maintaining professional distance was worth more than risking Sterling's attention. The fluorescent light above Laura's head buzzed with the frequency of something dying by inches. She stared at her reflection in the black coffee, distorted, rippling, barely recognizable. 15 minutes. She sat alone for 15 minutes. The clock on the wall read 19:04 hours when Sterling appeared in the break room doorway with the incoming shift clustering behind him like iron filings arranging themselves around a magnet. He was holding court, his voice carrying that tone of voice that suggested everyone should be grateful to breathe the same air. "Ah, our resident hero," he said, glancing at Laura with the kind of smile you give something you've already decided was worthless. "Nurse Nightingale over there in the corner. Perhaps next she'll want to perform surgery. 3 years of community college must make her feel like she's qualified to override Johns Hopkins medical training." He laughed. The incoming nurses laughed. The sound of it was like broken glass being dragged across ceramic. Laura didn't look up from her coffee. She didn't tremble. She didn't retreat. Her hands were steady on her clipboard, her breathing even, her posture a perfect lesson in how to absorb cruelty without flinching. This was what years of military discipline looked like, the ability to sit perfectly still while someone tried to erase you with words. She waited until Sterling finished. Waited until the laughter faded. Waited until he was turning away, his point made, his dominance established. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean in to hear it, that cut through the room like a scalpel through tissue. "I've seen men with more courage bleed out in the sand, Doctor." She paused. 1 heartbeat. 2. At least they died with honor. The fluorescent light buzzing overhead seemed impossibly loud. Sterling's face transformed, not red, not yet, but something darker, something that suggested a man whose control had just slipped in front of an audience. He stood frozen at the break room doorway, one hand suspended in mid-gesture, and for 6 full seconds nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then he turned on his heel and left without responding, his perfect white coat disappearing down the corridor toward his office. The incoming shift dispersed quietly. The break room emptied. Laura sat alone again at the corner table, her coffee growing cold beside her, and listened to the hospital sounds continuing uninterrupted. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in distant patient rooms, the monitors beeped their steady count of human heartbeats, the phones rang with their endless announcements of crisis and routine. She had no way of knowing what Sterling was doing in his office. She had no way of knowing that he was making phone calls. 3 of them. The first to a board member named Harrison who owed him for a patient referral scheme that had generated $47,000 in unnecessary surgeries. The second to the nursing credentialing office, demanding an investigation into Laura's suspicious license history and requesting a full audit of her personnel records. The third to a private investigator in Jacksonville with instructions to dig into her background, to find something, anything, that would discredit her, that would make her testimony unreliable if this situation escalated. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, at 0200 hours, Morrison's central venous pressure began to climb. His jugular veins distended like cords tightening around his neck. His heart sounds grew muffled. Laura heard it before the monitor alarmed, heard it the way a musician hears a wrong note in an orchestra. Beck's triad. The classic presentation screaming in his vital signs like a ship's distress beacon: hypertension, muffled heart tones, jugular venous distension, cardiac tamponade. His chest was filling with blood. Laura paged Sterling and the cardiothoracic surgeon simultaneously. The surgeon called back within 90 seconds to say he wasn't coming in without confirmed imaging due to liability exposure. Sterling arrived 7 minutes later, looked at Morrison's monitor, and pronounced his judgment with the certainty of someone who had never experienced being wrong. "We'll observe," he said. "Get him to CT." "He's too unstable to move," Laura said. "His pressure's 72/42 and dropping. He needs a pericardiocentesis now. I'm not performing an invasive procedure at 2 a.m. based on your hunch." Sterling's voice carried that particular flatness of a man making a decision he could hide behind. "We wait for imaging." But there was no imaging available. CT was backed up with 3 other trauma cases. The patient's condition continued deteriorating. 2 other ER physicians arrived, assessed Morrison's vitals, and stepped back from the bedside with the synchronized motion of men protecting themselves from liability. Sterling's voice went hard and final: "Nobody touches this patient until we have definitive imaging." "That's an order." He looked directly at Laura. "And you're already on thin ice, Bennett. One more cowboy move and you're done." Morrison's mother had stopped screaming in the hallway. That was somehow worse than the screaming. Laura stood at Morrison's bedside and watched his blood pressure collapse toward nothing, 70/40 now, his pupils blown wide with hypoxia, the monitors screaming in a 4-part harmony of systemic failure. She reached down to adjust the oxygen tubing and her hand brushed underneath the bed frame, and her fingers made contact with something unexpected. Boots. Combat boots. Worn leather, the kind that had walked through terrain that most people would never survive. The leather was cracked in precise diagonal patterns from the flex of a foot moving through sand. She knew those patterns. She knew them because she had the same patterns in the same boots in her locker, the ones she'd been wearing in Fallujah when her name got erased, when Operation Sand Viper got classified and buried 6 layers beneath official denial, when an 8-year-old Iraqi boy stopped breathing in her arms. Her hands began to shake. Just slightly. Just enough that if anyone had been watching, and nobody was, because everyone had retreated, they might have noticed. Just enough that the trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition. 202 minutes after the public humiliation, Petty Officer Morrison's chest began to fill with blood. Not a slow ooze, a progressive, inexorable filling that sent his central venous pressure spiking like a missile climbing altitude. The monitor displayed what Laura recognized immediately: the pressure climbing, the heart sounds muffling, the clinical signature of cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac, the thin membrane surrounding Morrison's heart, had collected 200 milliliters of whole blood from a small laceration in the right atrium, a bleeder that the first surgical team had somehow missed during damage control. His jugular veins distended like bridge cables pulled taut. His breathing became shallow, labored. His lips shifted toward a bluish tint that no amount of supplemental oxygen could reverse because the problem was mechanical, not respiratory. The heart couldn't fill. Without filling, there was no output. Without output, there was only shock arriving by degrees. It was 0200 hours. The ER had gone quiet the way hospitals do at that hour, the fluorescent lights humming their insistent frequency, the ventilator wheezed its rhythm like an animal breathing beside the bed, and outside the rain hammered the Savannah pavement with the relentless percussion of artillery on distant hills. Laura stood at the bedside, reading the monitor the way a combat medic reads a wound. The young resident who'd been monitoring Morrison, a careful woman named Chen, looked at the numbers climbing and then at the attending physician, Dr. Paulson, with an expression that asked a silent question. Paulson was already stepping back, his hands held low, his body language announcing retreat. The liability was too high. The outcome too uncertain. The precedent too dangerous if something went wrong. The attending moved toward the door. The resident followed. The nursing supervisor appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation with a glance, and said nothing because there was nothing professional to say. Morrison's pressure was now 65/38 and dropping with mathematical precision. At 55, the brain starts to ischeme. At 40, it begins to die. Laura had 12 minutes, perhaps less. Dr. Sterling was not in the ER when the pressure began its collapse. He'd left 20 minutes earlier with his phone already in his hand, moving with the deliberate stride of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it with the precision of someone who understood networks and leverage. The first call went to board member Hutchinson at 01 for 7 hours, a man who owed Sterling approximately $340,000 in undocumented referral kickbacks from a radiology contracting scheme that had funneled patients to Sterling's consulting company. "We have a problem," Sterling said, his voice steady, the kind of calm that comes from having already calculated contingencies. "There's a nurse. Name's Bennett. She's asking questions about equipment orders, and she's being observed by family members. High visibility. I need you to pressure the nursing director tomorrow morning. Insubordination, dangerous practices, the works. I'll document it on my end." Hutchinson had asked one question: will that end it? Sterling had answered, no. But it starts the process. The line went dead. The second call went to the credentialing office at Sacred Heart, a woman named Patricia who managed license verification and personnel files. Sterling had helped Patricia's daughter get into nursing school with a letter of recommendation that had carried weight. "I've noticed some inconsistencies in a personnel file," Sterling said, not bothering with preamble. Senior RN named Bennett. She lists a gap in her employment history between 2000 and 2008. 8 years. No explanation. No references from that period. No verifiable work history. That's the kind of thing that makes licensing boards uncomfortable. I'd recommend a formal investigation into her credentials. Something's not right. Patricia had agreed that it warranted looking into. Sterling had thanked her and hung up. The network was tightening. The third call went to a man named Vincent Cray, a private investigator based in Charleston who had helped Sterling before, locating employees who might testify against a lawsuit, finding dirt on difficult staff. "I need a background on someone," Sterling said. Laura Bennett. BENNETT, civilian nurse, Sacred Heart, Savannah. Something's off about her. Employment gaps, records that don't align, a past that's been buried. Dig into it. Military background, maybe. Travel. Anything that doesn't fit. I'll pay 50,000 for it. Cray had already begun typing. Sterling had ended the call and moved back into the ER hallway, his network now activated, his contingencies deployed, his hands clean. By morning, the questions about phantom equipment charges would be deflected by a formal investigation into Laura's credentials. By week's end, her employment would be terminated for misconduct. By the time anyone untangled the truth, Sterling would be in a new hospital system in a new city, his previous success buried under the weight of bureaucratic process. But at 0200 hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Morrison's pressure was now 60/35 and his lips had lost all color. Laura stood at the bedside in a posture that appeared passive but was actually the stance of someone making calculations. She'd calculated during 2 tours through Fallujah. She'd calculated in Ramadi, in Sanjin Valley, in a dozen Phi-base medicine tents where the only equipment available was what you could carry. The pressure was dropping. The patient had maybe 8 minutes. Every doctor had retreated with their liability concerns, leaving the bed surrounded by equipment but empty of courage. A young nurse named Morrison, no relation to the patient, stood near the crash cart, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the monitor, unsure whether she should follow the attending or remain. Laura caught her eye with a look that said without words, "Stay if you can, leave if you cannot." Laura opened the pericardiocentesis kit. The package seal released with a crisp sound that cut through the ventilator's rhythm. Equipment scattered across the metal bedside table, gauze, betadine prep, the 18-gauge needle with its plastic hub, the syringe, the ultrasound probe to guide the needle toward the fluid sac. She didn't think about Sterling's write-up on the unit board. She didn't think about the credentialing office or the private investigator or the lies already being constructed in careful phone calls. She thought about a boy named Kareem, 8 years old, trapped in a burning Humvee east of Baghdad during a convoy ambush in 2004. She had pulled him from the flames and held his small hand, while waiting for the medevac that never arrived in time. She thought about the 8 men in her SEAL Medical Corpsman team, their names scrubbed from every official record when Operation Sandviper was buried so deep that even the Pentagon pretended it had never existed. She thought about the Navy Cross citation she'd earned dragging 3 wounded through a kill zone in the Jolan district, a citation that officially belonged to someone else now, someone who didn't exist. She prepped Morrison's skin with betadine, the orange-brown iodine spreading in a circular pattern beneath her steady hands. A young nurse, not Morrison, had emerged from the back station and was now standing near Laura, watching. "Laura," she said, her voice uncertain. Dr. Sterling said. Laura cut her off without raising her eyes from the prep field. "Then don't watch." Her voice was quiet. It wasn't harsh. It was simply the tone of someone who had moved past the point where protocols and hierarchy mattered. The nurse didn't leave, but she also didn't say anything else. She simply watched as Laura located the subxiphoid space, the area just below the breastbone where the needle would enter, where the pericardial sac lay waiting behind the ribs and muscle and fascia. The needle entered with precision that came from muscle memory, from a body that had performed this procedure in conditions far more challenging than a well-lit ER with ultrasound guidance and sterile technique. The syringe attached to the needle was plunged inward at a 30-degree angle, and Laura watched as the landmarks aligned, breastbone as anterior, the angle of the ribs as a guide, the needle moving with calculated depth. She aspirated gently, and the syringe filled with dark red blood, 200 milliliters of tamponade, the pressure relief that Morrison's heart desperately needed. The fluid moved from pericardium to syringe with a hiss of air escaping, a small release that was far more dramatic than its volume suggested. Morrison's blood pressure response was immediate. 62. 84. 90. The monitor began to normalize. The lips began to regain color. The ventricular tones on the stethoscope separated from their muffled quality into distinct S1 and S2 components. "Good." That was all Laura said. The young nurse, her name was actually Chen, the resident who'd stepped back earlier, was now returning to the bedside, understanding that the crisis had shifted, that what had been impossible 30 seconds ago was now being managed by someone who appeared to be operating in a different reality from the one the hospital occupied. Laura remained at Morrison's bedside for the next 4 hours, through 0600 hours, watching the monitor with the attention of someone who understood that cardiac tamponade could return, that the bleeding might have resumed, that Morrison's pressure could drop again if anyone lost focus. She checked the output, the urine color, the oxygen saturation, the peripheral perfusion. She held the space where every other doctor had abandoned it. The rain outside continued until 04:30, then stopped with the abruptness of a valve closing. The fluorescent lights hummed without variation. And Morrison's heart continued to beat, continued to push blood, continued to keep his brain alive, all because a nurse in scrubs had remembered what it meant to choose duty over liability, to choose action over retreat. By 0600 hours, when the day shift began to arrive and the ER began its transition from night silence to morning chaos, Morrison was stable. His pressure was holding at 98/62. His oxygen saturation was solid at 97% on a high-flow nasal cannula. His urine output had resumed at a healthy 40 milliliters per hour. He was still unconscious, still sedated, still in critical condition, but he was no longer in the process of dying. He was no longer in the state where every attending physician had decided to step back and let nature take its course. And Laura had already removed her gloves, already disposed of the kit, already washed her hands with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, standing at a sink while the hot water ran over her knuckles and the soap created small suds that dissolved in the current like everything else eventually dissolved if you gave it enough time and enough pressure. She didn't think about the call Sterling had made. She didn't know about the credentialing office or the private investigator or the network closing around her like a noose. She only knew that Morrison was alive, that she had chosen action when action was forbidden, and that somewhere in a hospital hallway or a back office, someone was already making decisions that would ensure there would be a cost for what she had done. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she would make the same choice again, and again, and again, for as long as there were patients who needed someone to stand at the bedside when everyone else had already stepped back. She already knew how that story ended. She had already lived it once in Baghdad, and the ghosts had followed her to Savannah, and they would not let her do anything other than what Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had always done, the job. At 0200 hours, Laura's hands moved on their own. Needle in. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure readings climbed like she was reading sheet music she'd memorized 20 years ago in a different life. Petty Officer Jake Morrison's chest had filled with blood from a pericardial injury nobody caught until his pressure tanked to 60/0. Every attending physician in the trauma bay had stepped backward simultaneously, citing liability like it was a shield. Dr. Sterling had already left the ER. 3 phone calls made from his office. A network closing like a fist. But Laura remained at Morrison's bedside. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, who no longer officially existed, performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on a patient her hospital had abandoned. The 14-gauge needle found the pericardial sac. Fluid drained. Pressure climbed. 70, 80, 88, holding at 95 systolic. She adjusted the drip rates without waiting for orders. Her hands remembered the anatomy. Remembered the weight of making life and death decisions alone in a kill zone where there was no attending physician to defer to, no committee to consult, no liability to cite. For hours passed like minutes. For hours of continuous vigilance at Morrison's bedside. Central venous pressure at 8. Heart sounds clearing with each passing minute. She monitored his cardiac output the way she'd monitored the vitals of 7 dying men in Ramadi, using nothing but her hands, her ears, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst and chosen to survive it again. The hospital hummed around her, ventilator wheeze, monitor beep, the soft thud of her own heartbeat in her temples. Other nurses worked their own patients. Nobody approached Morrison's room. Nobody asked questions. Sterling had already made sure of that. By 0545 hours, Morrison's vitals stabilized completely. His pressure held at 110/70. His heart sounds were clear and strong, sinus rhythm, steady as a drummer who'd learned to keep time under fire. The crisis had passed. He would live. Laura had made sure of that. She could have stepped away then. Could have documented her findings, closed his chart, gone home knowing she'd done the job. The job was everything she had left. But she didn't step away until 0600 hours. She stayed with him through one more set of vital signs. One more assessment. One more confirmation that the bleeding had stopped, that the pericardial fluid was reabsorbing, that Jake Morrison would wake up and breathe and remember a woman named Laura had refused to let him die on her watch. At 0630 hours, Dr. Sterling entered the trauma bay. He walked directly to Morrison's bedside, saw the pericardiocentesis kit wrapper in the trash, and his face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. He didn't say a word to Laura. He didn't make eye contact. He turned and walked directly to the security office on the second floor. At 0715 hours, 2 security officers arrived at the nurses' station. Their uniforms were creased sharp as warnings. Their badges caught fluorescent light like reflections off water. One of them carried a cardboard box the size of a small coffin. Laura Bennett. Not a question. A statement. You need to come with us. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Sterling had made his 3 calls, activated his network, and pointed them at her the way a hunter points at prey. She set down her pen and followed them to the locker room where her belongings were already packed. Someone had been thorough. A cracked coffee mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" fading off the ceramic. A dying succulent she'd forgotten to water for 3 weeks, the leaves curled like hands reaching for something just out of reach. And a photograph of 8 people in desert camouflage whose faces the government had made her promise never to name. 8 soldiers. 8 friends. Operation Sandviper. The operation that had been erased, along with everyone who'd bled for it. They escorted her through the ER, past the break room where nurses suddenly found their phones very interesting, past the supply closet where she'd restocked thousands of times, past the trauma bay where Jake Morrison was still unconscious. His monitors beeped their steady rhythm. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's help. He would wake. He would live. But Laura was gone. The rain hit her the moment she stepped outside. Savannah summer rain, thick and warm and utterly indifferent. It soaked through her scrubs and plastered her hair to her forehead. The cardboard box grew soft in her hands. The photograph inside was getting wet. She could feel the ink beginning to blur, the faces beginning to dissolve. She didn't move to cover it. She just stood at the bus stop, water running down her face and neck, and stared at the box. This was the second time they'd erased her. The first time, the government had done it officially. Operation Sandviper had gone catastrophically wrong in Baghdad. She'd pulled a dying 8-year-old boy from a burning Humvee while rounds kicked up dust around her position. She'd carried him 3 blocks through a firefight. He died in her arms outside the aid station, and the military had decided that what she'd done that day could never be acknowledged because the operation itself had to be erased. They'd given her a new social security number. A new name on a new set of military records. A warning that if she ever surfaced, if she ever claimed to be Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, they would deny her existence so thoroughly that even her family would forget her name. Now a civilian hospital had done it for them. A bus passed without stopping. Another one came 20 minutes later and she didn't board it. Just stood at the stop, rain streaming down, holding a box containing the only evidence that she'd ever been anyone other than a nurse nobody wanted. The mug was trash. The succulent was dead. The photograph was dissolving into watercolor. She could have thrown it all into the storm drain. Could have walked away from Savannah tonight and found another city, another hospital, another life where nobody would recognize the weight in her shoulders or the way her hands moved with surgical precision or the fact that she'd saved a Navy SEAL's life after every doctor in the building had abandoned him. But that wasn't what Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett did. She didn't walk away from jobs unfinished. She didn't abandon posts. She didn't accept erasure, even when the erasure came with official paperwork and the force of an institution behind it. She stood in the rain and stared at the dissolving photograph and thought about Jake Morrison waking up in a hospital bed, his pressure stable, his heart beating strong, his life a continuation instead of an ending. She'd done the job. She'd done it perfectly. And the cost had been exactly what it had always cost her, everything. 3 days later, she was in the administrator's office signing her termination paperwork when 2 FBI agents walked through the door. They weren't there for her. They were investigating Dr. Sterling for insurance fraud, tracking phantom equipment charges, following a paper trail that led back to Hutchinson and a dozen other administrators who'd been funneling hospital money into private accounts for 4 years. They needed witnesses. Recently terminated staff. Laura signed her name one last time on forms that officially confirmed what the cardboard box had already proven: she no longer existed at Sacred Heart Hospital. When they asked her to walk them through the supplies Sterling had ordered, she complied. When they asked her to point out the discrepancies she'd noticed, she did. And when they escorted her back through the ER to collect her employee badge, they walked her past Jake Morrison's room. His eyes were open. The moment he saw her face, his entire body went rigid. The heart monitor accelerated. His oxygen saturation dipped. His lips moved, whispering a single word that detonated everything Sterling had worked to bury: Reaper. His voice cracked louder, straining against the breathing tube they'd just removed. Senior Chief. The hallway froze. Doctors stopped. Nurses looked up from their stations. A young nurse, trembling, pulled up Laura's license on the credentialing database. There was a flag, a federal seal. She clicked deeper. Her hands shook. A different file opened. She read aloud, her voice breaking over every word: Laura Bennett. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Navy SEAL Medical Corpsman. Embedded Tier 1 Operations. Ramadi. Fallujah. Operation Sand Viper, classified. Dr. Sterling's face went the color of old bone. Jake Morrison was crying now, trying to sit up against the restraint of his monitors and leads. She saved my life. In Baghdad. I was 8 years old. She pulled me out of a burning Humvee. The automatic doors hissed open and bootsteps echoed on linoleum. A Navy SEAL team leader in dress blues walked into the ER like he was walking onto a flight deck. His trident gleamed. His bearing held the weight of 1,000 combat operations. He walked directly to Laura and stood at attention. 3 days later, Laura signed the termination paperwork in the administrator's office when the doors opened and 2 federal agents in dark suits walked in without knocking. The older one, a woman with silver hair pulled back like a command structure, set a tablet on the desk. The younger agent positioned himself at the exit. Not a request. It was a command. Laura stood, hands steady, and followed them down the corridor of Sacred Heart Hospital without a word. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were counting down. They passed Petty Officer Morrison's room and he woke. His eyes went wide. He saw Laura being escorted past his window by the federal agents, saw the badges clipped to their belts, saw her face moving away from him like a memory fading. His mouth opened. One word came out, barely a whisper at first, then louder: Reaper. The name hung in the air like a defibrillator charge. His voice cracked on the next words. Senior Chief. That Senior Chief. A young nurse at the station, the same one who'd avoided Laura's eyes in the break room, froze. She stared at Laura's badge clipped to her scrubs. The termination paperwork was still in Laura's hand. The nurse's hands moved on their own, pulling up the federal database that nobody on the civilian side was supposed to access. Her voice trembled as she read aloud, citations for Vela as a SEAL medical corpsman embedded in Tier 1 operations. Operation Sand Viper. Classified. Ramadi. Fallujah. Each word landed like a punch. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. The monitor beside Morrison's bed beeped steadily, sinus rhythm, strong, alive because of hands that had held lives together in burning sand 20 years ago. Within the hour, the team leader arrived. Commander James Clayton walked through Sacred Heart's doors in his dress uniform, and the entire ER stopped breathing. He was the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, shoulders like a linebacker's, bearing that held the weight of 1,000 combat operations, eyes the color of storm cloud steel. Behind him came 3 more SEALs in tactical gear, their boots striking tile in perfect synchronization. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The room went dead silent. Clayton walked directly to Laura and stood at attention. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Her composure was a weapon. He spoke with the precision of someone who'd been breaching doors for 23 years. Senior Chief Bennett, Operation Sandviper is being declassified as of 0600 hours today. Your record is restored. Your team is being recognized. He paused. His jaw clenched. I'm ordered to inform you that SOCOM wants to talk about reinstatement to active duty. Laura's voice came out steady as a surgical laser. And Dr. Sterling. That was when the FBI agent produced the tablet. On the screen, 3 separate attempts to access federal military databases using a purchased black market credential. 2 emails to board member Hutchinson discussing neutralizing the Bennett problem. 1 recorded call to a private investigator, Sterling's voice, unmistakable, giving explicit instructions to create doubt about her service record, to make her look like a fraud who stole Valor. The voice on the recording was calm, methodical, evil in the way that only bureaucratic evil can be. Find something. Anything. I don't care if it's true. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway of the break room, saw the federal agents, and his face drained to the color of old bone. He tried to speak. This is a misunderstanding. I was simply. You tried to erase a decorated war hero. Commander Clayton cut him off. Again. The word again detonated something in the room. Everyone understood what it meant. This wasn't Sterling's first time trying to destroy someone. This was a pattern. This was the real Sterling, not the surgeon, not the ER director, but a man whose specialty was erasing people who threatened him. The FBI agent continued with the precision of someone reading a death sentence. We've been tracking your insurance fraud for 8 months, Dr. Sterling. Phantom equipment purchases totaling $847,000. Inflated billing codes across 123 patient claims. Kickbacks from 3 medical supply companies. But when you attempted to forge federal military records, you committed a felony that gave us jurisdiction. Sterling's network collapsed in real time like a building demolition. Board member Hutchinson is in custody, the agent said. He's cooperating. The credentialing director is suspended. The private investigator is cooperating. Every favor you called in is now evidence. 2 agents stepped forward. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was like a period at the end of a sentence. Sterling didn't resist. He just stood there, understanding finally that he'd chosen the wrong person to destroy. He'd picked someone who didn't break. He'd picked someone who'd survived worse than a hospital politics game. He'd picked someone who'd pulled dying children out of burning metal in a country nobody wanted to remember. They walked him out. Past every nurse who'd shunned Laura in the break room, and now those same nurses were watching, understanding finally what they'd done, what they'd failed to do. Past the unit board where her disciplinary notice still hung. Someone ripped it down mid-walk, the paper tearing like a throat clearing. Past Jake Morrison's room where the 8-year-old boy Laura had saved in Baghdad, now a decorated Navy SEAL himself at 28 years old, watched through the window, his hand pressed against the glass. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Laura stood perfectly still. 1 measured breath. Her hand steady. She didn't look at Sterling as he passed. She looked at Morrison instead, and he nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything. I remember. I was there. You saved me. You saved me twice. A single tear escaped and Laura wiped it without breaking eye contact with anyone. She said nothing. The tear was data. Pain is information. And her silence was louder than any speech could ever be. Commander Clayton handed her a phone. The screen was lit with a secure Pentagon line. SOCOM wants to talk to you, he said quietly. She put it to her ear, and the voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 20 years, her old commanding officer, the man who'd ordered Operation Sandviper, the one who'd had to file her away like a classified document and pretend she didn't exist. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Senior Chief, welcome home." 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Sterling at a strip mall in North Charleston, South Carolina. He was sitting at a folding table in front of a closed-circuit city, selling supplemental insurance policies to people who walked past without stopping. His medical license was permanently revoked. 3 felony convictions. His hand shook when he counted cash. He didn't look up anymore when people passed. He just stared at the insurance pamphlets like they were the only truth he had left. But that wasn't where the story ended. At Camp Pendleton in California, on a parade ground where the Pacific wind snapped flags overhead like machine gun fire, Laura Bennett stood in her dress blues. The uniform fit like it was made for her, because it was. Master Chief Petty Officer insignia on her collar, the rank she'd never gotten to wear the first time. Behind her, in perfect formation, stood her 8-man team from Operation Sandviper, the ones the government had said never existed. They were older now, grayer, but standing. Still standing. Still alive. Jake Morrison stepped forward in his own dress blues, a petty officer first class now, decorated for valor in 3 separate engagements. His hand shook when he reached for the pin, the new insignia she was accepting. He was pinning it to her collar in front of 200 assembled Navy SEALs, and his hands trembled because he remembered, burning metal, the smell of diesel fuel and blood, a stranger's hands pulling him free, holding him together long enough to breathe again. A stranger who turned out to be the best soldier he'd ever known. The commandant read her citations aloud to the assembly: Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. Silver Star for gallantry in action. Purple Heart for wounds received. Silver Star again. Purple Heart again. For service above and beyond in Operation Sandviper, Ramadi, and Fallujah, 2004 through 2006. Laura's eyes scanned the crowd and she saw faces she'd saved, teammates she'd bled with, and one old Iraqi interpreter holding a photograph of a little boy named Kareem. The boy was grown now. A doctor. In Detroit. At the reception that night, Commander Clayton raised a glass and the room fell silent. To Senior Chief Bennett, he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Who stayed for hours when nobody else would stay for minutes? All 200 SEALs raised their glasses. The sound was like thunder rolling across a desert. Laura stood, and the room watched her. She looked at her team, the family that had never erased her, the brothers who'd carried her name in their hearts through 2 decades of silence. Her voice came out steady, the voice of someone who'd walked through fire and found her way home. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She looked at Jake Morrison, at Clayton, at the old interpreter with the photograph. She allowed herself to smile. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please hit like and subscribe. Comment below, have you ever been judged and proven someone completely wrong? We read every single comment.